Hey everyone, welcome to week 2. I want to start by connecting what we're doing this week to where we left off. So last week, you read Asaldua's concept of mestiza consciousness, the idea that living between cultures, navigating contradictions of multiple worlds simultaneously, it's not a deficiency, it's not a problem to fix, it's a source of creative power. The mestiza, she writes, learns to juggle cultures, to operate in a pluralistic mode where nothing is thrust out, nothing is rejected, nothing is abandoned. In the Rutledge Handbook introduction, it gave you the disciplinary foundation, the reminder that for this community, the border didn't come to them. They came to it long before it existed as a border. As that famous line goes, the border didn't cross, we didn't cross the border crossed us. This week, we're grounding all of that in specifics. 3 readings, each one a different lens on the same essential question. Who are the people of the border? Where did that come from? And what shaped the communities that border leaders have to understand and serve? Let's start with Maciel and Garcia Acevedo. The starting point for this chapter is 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican American War and transferred 51% of the Mexican territory to the United States. Overnight, approximately 120,000 Mexicans found themselves living in a new country, one that hadn't invited them, didn't particularly want them, and had just finished taking their land by force. The Rutledge Handbook put it directly last week about them not crossing the border and the border crossing them. So from Maciel and Garcia Acevedo, they show us what came after that crossing. What followed was what the authors called el gran despojo, the great plunder, a systematic dispossession of land rights, of land, legal rights, and leadership through discriminatory laws, institutional practices, and outright violence. These communities didn't choose to immigrate. The border moved over them. And the response to that historical trauma has shaped Mexican American community life ever since. This chapter is specifically dismantling 2 myths that persisted in political and popular discourse. The first myth is that Chicanos and Chicanas turned their backs on Mexico, that they prioritized assimilation and left their culture of origins behind. The second myth is that Mexico showed little interest in its diaspora north of the border. Both of these, Maciel and Garcia Acevedo show us, are wrong. The reality is what they call 2 Mexicos. There's Mexico the nation, and then there's the Mexican origin community in the United States. Both have been in continuous, complex, mutually shaping relationships ever since 1848. Cultural exchange has never stopped. Political ties have persisted, economic links have deepened, and close to 80% of all Chicano Chicanas have lived within 200 miles of the border, which means for this community, the border isn't the edge of their world, it's the center of it. The chapter documents contributions across an enormous range of domains. There's art, muralism, music and corrido tradition, cinema, food, agriculture, labor, mutual aid organizations, labor movements, and political advocacy. These aren't footnotes to American culture, they're central to it. Here's a leadership takeaway. A border leader who doesn't know this history is operating without context. They'll misread the communities they serve, they'll misunderstand the source of pride and pain that show up in every meeting, every interaction, every moment. So you can either build trust with your people or break it. You cannot lead people whose history you don't know. Moving on to McField. Now, McField gives us a history of bilingual education, and what emerges is clear, a disturbing pattern. First, the distinction between program types. Bilingual education means using 2 languages to teach academic subjects, not just teaching a foreign language as a subject. The 2 main approaches are transitional bilingual education, which uses the primary language as a bridge to English, and maintenance, or a dual language program, which develop full biliteracy in both languages. The overwhelming majority of programs in US history have been transitional. So the goal has been to get students to English as quickly as possible, not to maintain or develop their home language. Here's a pattern that runs through this entire chapter. Language policy has always tightened during high immigration periods. This is not a coincidence. It's correlation, and it's consistent enough across 2 centuries of American history to be a structural phenomenon. California mandated English-only instruction in 1855, so the same year the state stopped publishing laws in Spanish, right in the wake of the Mexican-American War. During World War I, 34 states required English only in all public and private schools in 1998. California passed Proposition 227, an English-only initiative after the foreign-born population in the state had grown dramatically over the preceding decades. And the message is always the same. When immigration increases, pressure on language increases. I want to say something directly about the experience you may recognize from your own families. My family as well, my aunts, my uncles, and my mom, being hit with rulers for speaking Spanish in elementary school. That wasn't just a rogue teacher that did that. That was policy. That was an institutional decision that speaking your home language in school was unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. And the communities on this border have been living with the consequences of that decision in gradual rates, in educational outcomes, and in the complicated relationship many people have with their own language and their own identity for generations. The good news is that dual language programs are now in at least 38 states and growing. A seal of biliteracy has been adopted in 23 states, and the understanding that bilingualism is an asset, not a deficit, and that idea is slowly becoming policy rather than just an idea. In terms of the leadership takeaway for this, language policy is not just an education issue, it's a leadership issue. The decision institutions make about language shape workforce preparation, community trust, and the relationship between border communities and the institutions that are supposed to serve them. A border leader needs to understand this history to understand why language is never just about words. And finally, let's get into the Montes Alcalá piece. So what Spanglish actually is. So for this article, they give us something that I think is one of the most practically useful things in this week's readings for anyone who wants to lead effectively on this border. A real scholarly account of what Spanglish actually is, as opposed to how it's typically misunderstood. And we can start with what it's not. A lot of people think that Spanglish is just broken Spanish or broken English, and it's not. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a type of Spanish contaminated by English words. That definition reflects exactly the type of stigma that we're talking about, that we're pushing back against. Spanglish is not contaminated anything. It is a sophisticated, rule-governed, identity-laden communicative practice that reflects the lived reality of bilingual border communities. And here's where I want to pull back what we looked at with Ansaldúa, because this is exactly what she was describing last week. She wrote that the mestiza learns to juggle cultures and operates in a pluralistic mode. Nothing is thrust out, the good, the bad, the ugly, nothing rejected, nothing abandoned. Spanglish is that juggling made audible. It's not a failure to choose one language over the other, it's both, simultaneously in the same breath. That's not linguistic deficiency, that's Anzalduan consciousness expressed in everyday speech. What Spanglish actually is at the linguistic level includes code switching, moving fluidly between English and Spanish within the same conversation or even in the same sentence. It includes borrowings, integrating English words or structures into Spanish in predictable, systemic ways. And it exists within what linguists call a diglossic pattern, where English tends to be the language of formal public contexts like school and work, while Spanish occupies intimate private contexts like home and family, with Spanglish living the overlap between those worlds. So Montes Alcalá also introduces a more important concept, covert prestige. Spanglish may be stigmatized from the outside by institutions, mainstream discourse, or by people who think it signals poor education or linguistic deficiency. But within border communities, it carries a real social and cultural value. It signals belonging. It signals that you're from here. It's an ethnic identity marker, particularly for second and third generation Latinas and Latinos who are navigating exactly the kind of in-between space Anzaldúa was describing. And let's be clear about the stakes. Junot Díaz won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel written in Spanglish. Juan Felipe Herrera became the U.S. Poet Laureate writing in this tradition. This is not a marginal or deficient linguistic practice. It is a living, creative, intellectually rich form of expression. One important distinction. So Montes Alcalá discusses what anthropologist Jane Hill called mock or junk Spanish. The kind of thing you hear when Brad Pitt's character in a movie says he needs a lift in your El Trucco to the next towno. That is not Spanglish. That is linguistic appropriation, usually produced by monolingual English speakers, and it often functions as subtle racism by reducing the language of border communities to a joke. Now, knowing the difference between authentic Spanglish, and mock Spanglish is part of what it means to be a culturally intelligent leader on the border. And if you live in El Paso, you know how often Spanglish is spoken. So, in terms of the leadership takeaway, a leader who understands Spanglish understands something profound about how border communities signal trust, belonging, and identity through language. A leader who dismisses as improper or uneducated has already communicated something important and typically damaging about how they see the people they're supposed to lead. So, how do we connect all of these three back to week one? Let's pull this together. So, Anzaldúa gave you the theoretical framework last week about a mestiza consciousness, the tolerance for ambiguity, the power of living in the in between. And the Rutledge Handbook gave you the disciplinary and historical framing, a field built on recovering voices and histories that have been systematically overlooked. This week, we moved on to Maciel and Garcia Acevedo showing you the specific historical and cultural context of that between, who these communities are, what they've survived, and what they've built and what they've contributed. McField shows you how institutions have used language as a tool of power and how communities have resisted. And then Montes Arquela shows you how language at the community level reflects, preserves, and creates exactly the kind of hybrid identity Anzaldúa theorized. Language on the border is never just communication, it's history, it's identity, it's belonging, it's power. And a leader who doesn't understand that is missing something fundamental about the communities that they serve. So that's all I have for you this week. Good luck on the discussion boards, and I'll see you next week.